and welcome to another episode of Rhapsody in Cinema, the podcast where we talk about movies, memories, and everywhere in between. My name is Stephen Romney, I am the host, I am a freelance film critic and armchair psychiatrist in my spare time. And joining me tonight is another familiar voice if you listen to the Geek News Reviews and Opinions podcast. He can often be found by his handle, ShadowBlazer 3000. We also know him as Alex Short. At this time of recording, we've just barely passed through Independence Day, so how was your 4th?
My 4th was, I guess, pretty typical. I did pick up an extra shift for, holiday pay and that, because that's always nice, and just came home, had a nice little family dinner with the family, and watched some fireworks from my house, because all my neighbors have love to put on great firework displays, so I don't need to go anywhere. I can just stand on my driveway and watch the neighbors to have fun.
Yes, that's always nice. Getting to watch fireworks either without having to leave your house or without having to pay for them.
Absolutely.
Alright, now, people who are familiar with Alex's channel may be a bit surprised by the film we're talking about this time. I actually was a little bit surprised when he suggested it, as the film we are talking about today is the 2007 psychological thriller Zodiac, directed by David Fincher. Now, let's just go straight into it. Why is Zodiac your favorite film?
Zodiac is probably one of my favorite live-action films for there's a strong amount of reasons. It is, of course, the whole structure of it. For one, I've always been a bit of a sucker for historical movies, biographical films, police films, reenactment films, all that kind of stuff. So this movie pretty much tapped into everything in that. And plus that, long before seeing this movie, I had read the book that it was based upon when I was still in middle school. So I already had a pretty good fascination with the case myself. There have been a lot of historical dramas kind of similar to this, like procedural dramas or just kind of weird, intriguing, kind of psychological dramas, but none really clicked with me the way Zodiac did, especially considering this was also my first real David Fincher film. I'd never had before seen anything like Alien 3 or Fight Club or any of his other real work that he was known for.
Yeah, indeed, and that's actually kind of where I'm at as well. This is actually my first David Fincher film, so definitely an interesting introduction to his style. Mainly because I was too young for Alien 3, Fight Club, my mom probably wouldn't have let me watch it if I'd known about it. This definitely made for an interesting thing, but I can also see why they seem to pick him for thrillers, because even with these slower moments, there was still he was very good at building tension. At least that was the biggest thing I saw from the film, especially with some of the later scenes where you're kind of left wondering, okay, is this person Zodiac or is this person Zodiac? And you basically see Robert kind of freaking out of, oh, am I actually in Zodiac's house?
Yeah, the basement scene is a really great moment. It's very much a movie moment, but it's a great moment for how much Fincher really builds the creepiness and tension of it. Hey, a fun fact for anybody listening to this, in that scene, the dude's house that Robert Graysmith, who's played by Jake Gyllenhaal in the movie, the man he's with is actually he was actually the voice of Roger Rabbit. Charles Fleischer, that's it. So it is just the most bizarre sort of reversal of casting you could ever imagine.
There's a lot of actors that a lot of people, that are famous now, but back when this film came out, they were still relatively unknown, because I know another major player is Mark Ruffalo, who plays one of the main detectives. I mean, most people know him now as the Hulk, but that was back when he did mostly a lot of independent features. And it's always kind of fascinating to see an actor in a role before they are famous, before they really got pigeonholed to playing specific roles. It kind of reminded me a little bit of his performance in Spotlight, especially kind of the interplay when Robert is trying to convince him of, hey, here's all these evidence I gathered together to prove that this guy could very well be Zodiac. And you just see throughout the time, he's just like, hey, you're literally coming to my house in the middle of the night, knocking on my doors. If it wasn't for the fact that I'm an officer of the law, I would probably just shoot you.
You could really tell that with David Toski, who was played by Mark Ruffalo, and Ruffalo's great in this movie. And of course, it is also really fitting that he gets to also play against Robert Downey Jr. in this movie, and this was kind of pre-Downey's big comeback thanks to Iron Man. Downey had been in and out of trouble with the law and drug rehab and that, and I think he probably had something else prior, but I know one sort of big role he had prior to this movie was like the Shaggy Dog, that like 2006 remake. So this was kind of a nice, I think, step back for him to get back into a serious role before Iron Man really perpetuated him back into the mainstream again.
Especially when you can tell, and I know a lot of it may just be because he knows what it's like to be an addict, he was very much able to sell the reporter who starts out just writing the usual stories, but clearly becomes unhinged because of the experience. Especially when Robert tries to visit him later to try to basically get the back articles in order to compile them into the book, and you basically just find out where he's more or less useless because he's basically been living in a houseboat for who knows how long.
Yeah, it's a great performance by Downey. You watch him slowly just kind of unravel. I mean, I guess when I saw him, I always figured there was a bit of a edginess, eccentricity to Paul Avery. And you watch him become unhinged, and you kind of watch Gyllenhaal's character, Robert Graysmith, who, in the film, this is pretty much dramatized for the film, I know that for sure, that he takes on Avery as sort of a mentor, somebody he kind of idolizes, and at the same time has to let go and lose that mentor so that he himself can pursue this concept of writing the book, and then he eventually projects that mentorship into Dave Tosky's character.
Mm-hmm. And it's also just kind of fascinating, just a lot of the very tense interplay, especially during that interrogation scene where the detectives from the different precincts are interrogating Arthur Lee Allen, who both the novel and the film allege may have actually been the real identity of the Zodiac killer. And this kind of surprised me because I recognized the actor. I didn't know his name, but I knew him from a lot of comedies, and that one was definitely weird, seeing like a comedic actor going to a serious role, not just a serious role, but one that was, in a sense, terrifying, where he very much was able to sell the whole notion of if it was him, he knew that they couldn't touch him.
Yeah, John Carroll Lynch, I remember him quite a bit in the Drew Carey Show, and you're right, he was very much a comedic actor, and you got a lot of actors who either they're really good chameleons in real life already, because another prominent actor, so to speak, I guess he's more prominent in nerd circles, is Elias Koteas, who plays Jack Molinax, and Koteas is also known for the original Ninja Turtles, Casey Jones. So you have a really stellar cast in this, just of all different ranges and types, from comedic, John Carroll Lynch again. You have Jake Gyllenhaal, who'd been in a few different movies before this, and Mark Ruffalo and Robert Downey Jr. I think that's another strong point of the film, is David Fincher really found a lot of excellent actors, even actors just for bit roles, like Dermot Mulroney as the section chief for SFPD.
And another thing I also like, and it's something you don't really see in a lot of dramas involving the police, is just how much of a pain in the ass it is to try to consolidate resources across multiple police departments, where you had the Vallejo County Department had one piece of evidence, but then you had all these other counties that had other pieces of evidence, and they're basically trying to do all the horse trading so that they can all get on the same page, all while Zodiac is sending letters saying that he'll kill more and more people, creating kind of a ticking clock element with no countdown in sight.
And the police can't be sure that he won't act on these threats. They have to take him seriously. And the movie addresses this two ways, both in the serious and a slightly lighthearted moments, when mostly I think it's just Tosky and Armstrong. They have to kind of interview all the crazies who claim they have some information. And it's a bit of great levity to the movie without getting too crazy with it either. I forgot to ask, actually, did you watch the theatrical cut or director's cut?
I think it was the theatrical cut. That was what I was able to get a hold of.
Okay. There's not a huge difference between cuts, just a few slightly extended scenes, and one scene I know got left out of the theatrical cut. You have Tosky and Armstrong laying out pretty much all the evidence they can possibly lay out to obtain a search warrant to go search Lee Allen's trailer, and you hear Jack Molinax over speakerphone. There's no cross-cutting, it's just them in the office talking to a speakerphone, but it really does show very well the intensity of police bureaucracy and how much work has to go into getting up search warrants.
Yeah, especially with the people claiming they know information about Zodiac and then just getting details wrong. that is something that cops do frequently have to deal with, especially with high-profile cases that get media attention. It's kind of a psychological thing where imagine if you were the person who led to the arrest of Zodiac, naturally someone's going to want that sort of 15 minutes of fame, however brief it may be, because that's the kind of thing, that's kind of what made a lot of high-profile trials, even in this day and age, really, really difficult, where you then just get flooded with a bunch of tips that are either bogus or people claiming that they're, like, for the sake of this example, people that claiming that they're Zodiac, mainly because of that other messed up pursuit of notoriety.
Yeah, and that's still been going on very much with the Zodiac case. There's been like every few years there's a lot of new claims that seem to surface, and I think it was like last year a prominent presidential candidate got accused of being the Zodiac killer.
Yeah,
I think it was Ted Cruz or Ted.
Yeah, it was Ted Cruz.
Right.
Yeah, and literally it all started because the initial reason it started, and I'm guessing it's because the person propagating this was doing it as a joke, was because the sketch that was released to the public that of who they thought was Zodiac looked eerily similar to Ted Cruz, and the meme spiraled from there.
Yeah, that was pretty nuts. I had a good laugh at that.
Yeah, I mean, and for people actually wondering, oh, could it actually be Ted Cruz? Well, given that Ted Cruz went to college in 1992, highly unlikely, given that the Zodiac murders occurred during, like, 77 to 79 was kind of when the whole investigation manhunt thing was going on.
Yeah, and well, the first killing started, I think, as early as '68. There's another aspect of the movie that they really played with was the filmmakers kind of set out with this rule. They didn't want to show any particular killings where there were no surviving witnesses or other eyewitnesses, and they also decided to have a different actor portray the killer each time because there's different eyewitness accounts.
Especially when you consider that when certain cases were reported, the ethnicity would change, the height, the hair color, sometimes the face would be covered, sometimes not. It's also a very fine line to walk when you consider that even though people suspected Arthur Lee Allen, he was never formally charged. In fact, 2 days before he was supposed to be charged, he died of a heart attack. And based on how our legal system works, he's still technically innocent in the eyes of the law, so they can't really make any broad generalizations like that without the risk of potentially getting sued. And that's kind of one thing that is both awesome but also frustrating about our legal system is the presumption of innocence, but that's why we have all the red tape to get a search warrant because, well, we assume innocent until proven guilty, burden of proof is on the prosecution. And it's interesting when they show a film that actually communicates, hey, this is actually a lot of work. It's not like a Law and Order episode where they can bend the rules for the sake of moving the episode along.
Yeah, they definitely do stick as close as they can to being as realistic as possible, though still willing to take needed artistic license when needed. And Fincher's attention to detail is just really stunning in this movie.
Yeah, and that's something I have definitely noticed, especially with the way he composed certain shots as well. I mean, it was definitely a few times where I had to kind of stop and take a look at just how he framed it. It's very much one of those cases where a lot of films nowadays that are period pieces will just basically do like, okay, this shot, but here you can see the actual method to it, where you can see like, okay, let's actually reinforce what the story we're telling, reinforce the mood, the atmosphere. I mean, especially like that scene where the Mark Ruffalo's character went to the movie theater to relax, and it just so happens that they're playing a movie that was made around that time that was capitalizing on the Zodiac craze called Scorpio, where it had a mysterious criminal sending cryptic coded letters making a lot of the same threats, and while that exchange is probably heavily dramatized, it's definitely got to suck when you're just like, hey, this guy we haven't caught yet, they're already making movies about, you're basically giving him what he wants.
Yeah. Oh, for clarity, the movie's Dirty Harry.
Dirty Harry, okay.
Right.
Yeah, I need to watch more movies. That's my problem.
It is a great movie with Clint Eastwood. I do highly recommend it. It's a fun movie, but it's a little charged for its time, definitely. And as far as I know, I think that actually did happen. I believe they did screen that for SFPD, and so in kind of surreal reality imitating art imitating reality here, they screened Zodiac also for like SFPD and people who were a part of it, and so basically they got to watch themselves watching themselves watch a movie about themselves. So it's like this bizarre 6 layers of Inception stuff going on.
Yeah, all that's missing is the foghorn. Yeah, I did not know that actually, that they actually screened it. But that definitely must be a very weird feeling, especially given that a lot of the people who did work the case are still alive. Like, or at the very least, they were alive when this film came out. And it's always definitely a delicate thing when you're making a film based on real events, wanting to make sure that you're doing justice to the victims while still getting the facts straight. It's always very tricky, but looking at with the way Fincher handled the cases where there were survivals, it looked like he handled it at least tastefully fairly well. And this, granted, based on my limited knowledge of the actual facts.
Yeah, and James Vanderbilt and the producer also went to great lengths to talk to the people who were involved. They talked to Toschi, they talked with Graysmith, they talked with any of the survivors who were willing to talk, and they tracked down Mike Mageau, and they found Brian Hartnell, and they talked with them. So they wanted to be respectful with the film and be respectful to the people who experienced it.
Now, I guess that's kind of why, at least in the case of my sister, why she got so fascinated by it, was just that level of detail. Mainly because it's something that's always important with a lot of thrillers that I'm not really seeing from a lot of modern films, where kind of what keeps a story like Zodiac going is that desire to know. I mean, it's Jake Gyllenhaal's character says it best, when his wife is asking him, when will you be done? When will you stop? And he's just like, I want to see him face to face and know that it's him. That is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, like, that's my end goal. I want to see him face to face and know that it's him. And you get that at the very end, where you can just tell it's like unnerved, where he goes into the hardware store, sees Arthur Lee Allen, and he's just like, yep, that's him.
There's still a lot of different theories about who the potential killer is. Not everybody is set on Arthur Lee Allen. I think ZodiacKiller.com, which is like the foremost site of documenting the Zodiac killer, kind of goes against that. But Graysmith is very much set in the fact that it probably is Arthur Lee Allen. And I know he has 2 books that make the whole case. I've only actually read the one book, the main book that the movie is based off of.
Yeah, and that's always a tricky thing, given that again, Zodiac was never caught. And another thing that I liked that the film brought up was how, with some of the letters, Zodiac, at least in the context of the movie, took credit for crimes that had happened to be committed, but then later on, when Paul Avery is explaining to Robert, was like, oh yeah, well, I know he's full of BS, because of these murders that he claimed to take credit for, the police officers already had the suspect in custody.
And the book definitely expands on that too, because the book also talks about some of those potential victims. As far as I recall, the book never outright. I think the only one the book I think really makes the case for is Sherry Jo Bates and maybe Kathleen Johns, who are still considered doubtful potential victims, but the movie definitely handles that the same way.
Yeah, and I think it kind of really ties well into one of the underlying themes, at least what I got, is kind of that pursuit of fame and notoriety. You have Zodiac trying to he's basically trying to be the real-world equivalent of the Riddler, with the code cipher saying, hey, I did these crimes, solve these codes, catch me, prove that, and very much is like, I know you're not going to, and that proves that I'm smarter than you. But then at the same time, you kind of see how a lot of people could perceive Robert Graysmith as also being after that same notoriety, the fact that he's going to different police departments and talking to different people, and especially when they frame it in the book of, in the movie actually, of like, oh, this guy's getting these together for the sake of the book, and then when you have that new Zodiac letter, and they say, oh, it was written by David Toschi, it wasn't the real Zodiac, he was just trying to drum up more interest in the case. And so it very much is that, you pretty much see all these underwriting things of a bunch of people, whether they're wanting it or not. Like, Zodiac, it's clear he wants fame, notoriety, even the whole, oh yeah, I want there to be Zodiac buttons. But then you have other people thinking, oh, well, are other people working on this case after that same messed up sense of notoriety?
Yeah, I mean, there is that scene where the police even start to kind of question Toschi. It's before the whole incident where he gets accused of writing another letter. It's right when they're about to go down to Riverside, and some of the cops, and particularly Ken Narlow, who's played by Donald Loesch in this film, he says, like, Dave, you do get your name mentioned up a lot, people do talk, but of course Toschi still wants to emphasize, I don't talk about ongoing investigations. And of course, you see the same conflict when Toschi confronts Avery just outside the Riverside police station, and the two have an argument about, is Avery hurting more than he's helping?
Yeah, and that is definitely a issue that we're still facing in society of if a case becomes so high profile, does it hurt the process? I mean, most notably you see with like the Casey Anthony case or the George Zimmerman cases where those cases were so heavily publicized that it made jury selection almost impossible for such a long time because the media coverage had already colored most people's opinions. It's actually something we're even seeing now with the Shkreli fraud case where so many jurors are just refusing to be jurors because they can't stand the guy.
Yeah, it does. It definitely happens with these high-profile cases. I just rewatched American Crime Story, The People versus O.J. Simpson, and that definitely goes into a lot of details about how much of a nightmare it was to serve and pick that jury.
Yeah, and it's always fascinating when you see films go into details like this of kind of, because a lot of people try to create the basic, like, good versus evil, even if the main character is kind of an anti-hero, like Dirty Harry, for example. They still try to keep a lot of the motivations clear-cut, and it's always fascinating when a film tries to address the fact that, no, it isn't that simple. There's a lot of stuff you have to do before you can actually charge anyone, before you can actually arrest them, this, that, and the other. And I think that's kind of where a lot of the magic in this film is just all of the hoops all these people were trying to go through to find and hopefully arrest this maniac who was terrorizing the public, even if he hadn't been doing anything at all.
Yeah, and it's so structured in a way that it feels compelling and it feels interesting. Again, to kind of compare to another movie, it's a different kind of movie, but like the year before, I saw The Good Shepherd starring Matt Damon, and I just remembered that feeling that movie went on too long. It felt like such a long movie, and this was a very uninteresting person when it should, in all theory, be a really interesting movie. It's about some of the early people behind the Central Intelligence Agency, but somehow just somewhere it got all muddled. And I have not seen the movie myself, but I've heard the same about Brian De Palma's The Black Dahlia, which I know actually before Zodiac, David Fincher was interested in, but plans fell through.
Yeah, and it's very much a mark of a good movie where even when it's long, because this film, at least the theatrical cut, is almost 2.5 hours long, and it's definitely a mark of a good film where even though it's long, you still get invested. You don't feel like you're bored or anything. It keeps you hooked. It keeps you invested all the way through, and that's something that's very much a struggle, especially when it's not a very high concept, but a much more grounded and realistic story.
Yeah, and this movie is a think piece, but it, like I said, it's just so compelling that I've never felt bored once by watching it. I watched it in the theater, and I loved it when I saw it in the theater, and of course then I first got the DVD when it came out. That was the original theatrical cut. Then I got the director's cut, which has a bit more to it, so I just mostly stick with the director's cut now. But you'll probably be fine with either. The director's cut's probably only about 10 or 15 minutes longer.
Yeah, and that's always kind of a tricky thing. I know, especially since the director's cut, they actually don't currently have any major prints on the market, and that was kind of why I had to settle for the theatrical cut. Because on Amazon alone, the director's cut was running for like a solid $50 or so. That would meant having to import it from Germany, of all places, as well.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, fortunately, yeah, I heard it got a pretty small, limited print run, which is a shame, because I think it's a really good movie, and it's my preferred version, but I still say you'll be good with either.
Yeah, hopefully either Shout Factory or the Criterion Collection will pick it up in the near future. Because there's been a few, those are the two companies that tend to pick up like well-known, like lesser-known classics that actually left a mark on the industry in one way, shape, or form. Speaking of seeing it in theaters, that does lead to the next major question of when, and you may have elaborated before, but when did you first see Zodiac?
I saw it when it first came out. I don't remember the exact date. It was, I believe March 2007 is when the movie came out. So I saw it somewhere within the first few weeks of its opening, and that would have been my senior year of high school, so just would have been right before graduating, and so that was an interesting time, because certainly I'm old enough now that, hey, I could go to R-rated movies without having to get worried I never got carded ever, but I can go see these movies on my own now. I can drive. I have a bit more disposable income to see more movies more often. So that was a good time to see movies, really.
I'm trying to remember year-wise. I think that would have been my freshman year of high school or so when it came out. Yeah, either freshman or sophomore year. Granted, I wasn't really into a lot of the dramas back then, because let's just say that was a weird... I had very different tastes. But I can definitely see, like, seeing it now, I can definitely see why my sister got hooked, because she was very much into those types of dramas, particularly ones that are very much psychological thrillers, so she was into stuff like Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon. A lot of those psychological thrillers that you're just kind of... It's not so much about, oh, if they're going to catch them, if they're going to stop them, but it's just more about the kind of the how of the main villain. That's kind of where a lot of the meat really is.
Yeah, especially when you already know the case, and I knew the case because I've mentioned before, I read the book and I did my own sort of due diligence and read more stuff online. So of course I knew Zodiac never got caught, but I was interested, how are they going to present this whole story to film? And that's what I like about it. It's almost kind of like juggling a few different stories here. You have a police procedural story, you have the story of the crimes that were committed, and you have the story of the person who was really the one to help canonize it all and help the public knowledge with his book. And it's all so seamlessly strung together that you never feel like you're watching like three different movies. You still feel like you're always in the same story, in the same movie, just on a different part, following a different character.
Especially as you follow kind of the march of time, where you just see how it slowly wears down everyone around it. I mean, you first have Toski and his partner at the start of the case, but then partway through you have Toski's partner transfer to another department because all of the stuff, it gets to him, and he's just like, yeah, I'm going to move to something investigating fraud because I kind of want to sleep at night. And then you see just later on how it takes a toll on Avery, and then how by the time Graysmith is wanting to investigate, nobody really wants to deal with it anymore because it's just like, hey, we've moved on. All the leads went dead. We're not talking about this anymore, so please just let it go.
Yeah, and you see it took a toll on Graysmith's own relationship with his wife, and well, that was like his second divorce, I think, and he actually told the filmmakers after, I think after seeing the movie, he actually told the filmmakers, God, now I know why my wife divorced me.
Yeah, that's definitely gotta hurt to have the mirror held up in your face like that, but, well, that's the power of film. It helps put things in perspective. And that's kind of the other thing, is that, yeah, it focuses on the large-scale cases, but it also focuses on the effects on interpersonal relationships. I mean, as you mentioned with Graysmith and the fact that it's made clear why his marriage fell apart, especially, and again, probably dramatized, where he even gets his kids involved trying to cross-reference data. Yeah, like that would be any reason for any woman to want to leave her husband if you're literally recruiting your kids in a murder investigation, because that's kind of effed up.
Well, once again, that's a truth in television. Apparently Graysmith really would like take his kids everywhere, including visiting like the crime scenes. So
Jeez.
He's like a bit of a strange man, I guess.
Yeah, then again, it was a very strange time. I mean, especially just imagine, like, you start out as a cartoonist, and then you see what basically amounts to what would normally be a movie happening in your workplace. That would definitely shake anyone.
I can only imagine what it was like during the late 60s, early 70s, especially in San Francisco.
Yeah, especially given that was a time when the media cycle moved a lot more slowly than it did today, because a lot of people listening to this podcast may not realize, but back then there was no Twitter, there was no YouTube, there was no internet, really. You basically had the newspapers, the radio, and television as means of getting your news. And so, naturally, you would have things where they're just like, okay, you actually have time to deliberate whether or not to publish these cryptic letters, and really discuss, hey, is he going to follow through on his threat, or are we just making it worse by giving him the audience that he wants? That's something that would get really rushed to production in one way, shape, or form. Like, they would either try to, like, hide it right away or try to publish it right away. Like, imagine if Zodiac had a Twitter account. That would just be messed up.
Oh, wow. I can't imagine him in this day and age. That's just horrifying to think about.
That's another thing that I've noticed when a lot of films, especially nowadays when they're trying to do these mystery psychological thrillers, specifically try going back to these older time periods. That way they don't have the excuse of, oh, why didn't they use their cell phones? Like, oh, well, it's because they weren't prominent. They didn't exist. So now we can actually write this thriller story as a thriller story.
It is definitely a thing that to consider is how much technology is going to play into your story, especially if it is a crime story.
Especially when you consider how much it's affected law enforcement as well. I mean, nowadays you have kind of this disconnect where you have cops that either know how to handle digital issues, digital threats. I mean, we're still dealing with the issue of, okay, should threats made on the internet, like through sites like Twitter or via email, so on and so forth, should those be prosecuted the way they would be if it happened in person? That's still an ongoing debate. You still have officers who aren't equipped to deal with that. And so it's definitely something to consider, especially when you look at the events of the Zodiac case and just how hard it was back then.
You know, there's actually quite a bit of CGI, but it's very well done. There's some digital shots of San Francisco. A lot of the blood was done digitally because they didn't want to spend a lot of time getting actors put in makeup and cleaning them off for different takes. So Fincher really is very good with visual effects. Makes sense because that's where he really got a start. He worked at ILM before getting into directing. So I really always thought he has a great visual eye for visual effects.
Yeah, especially since that's also how they tend to age up certain places now, where if you're shooting a period film, rather than having to build a backlot or telling people who own these businesses, hey, we need to cover up these signs or take these signs down or put these signs up, it's a lot easier to just use a matte painting to basically paint out the anachronisms so that you can create that vintage cityscape. I know that that's also pretty common with films like Gangster Squad and a few other period films where that's just how they do it, since it's a lot easier to do it digitally than invest the extra amount of money to literally de-age a city.
Yeah, and he shot most of the film digitally as well. They still used film for like slow motion, but it's really great contrast of editing here. I know he used Angus Wall was his editor, and he went on to work with him again in The Social Network, and you see a lot of the sort of same editing patterns that crop up in future Fincher films that I really remember from this prominently.
That's something I didn't really quite notice, but now that you've pointed out, that also would explain how smooth some of the shots were when they were tracking the cars, when, as someone who's actually tried shooting shots tracking vehicles, it's a lot harder. So now there is, oh yeah, CGI, that's probably why some of that stuff looked really smooth.
Yeah. Looks great, really does. For 2007, I definitely can say it looks great. You probably wouldn't even know it if you didn't think about it.
Definitely a good film I would recommend for anyone who, not just for people who are fascinated by serial killers, but also people who do have an interest in journalism, since it's one of the few films where you actually kind of see kind of the work that journalism is, where it isn't all just, oh, we just write and cover things and be at certain places. It's like, hey, it's a good amount of legwork, especially when you look at how Avery breaks the news of, oh, this Riverside killing may also be Zodiac, much to the chagrin of both the Riverside police force, but also the other police forces that are trying to catch Zodiac, where they're just like, hey, this reporter just broke this news story and has basically thrown people into a frenzy.
I know from that, Fincher said one of his big inspirations for that was All the President's Men. So you can definitely feel that movie. I've actually not seen that movie, but I've seen clips out of it, and you can feel Fincher's influences on his sleeve here, and it works very well for this movie.
All right, well, on that note, we're kind of pretty much almost at the end of it, so I guess since there's not much else to say, I really have to thank you for joining me tonight here. Is there anything you would like to plug or promote for the listeners at home?
Just for those who want to follow me or just curious of what I do, my name is ShadowBlazer 3000 on YouTube. My channel really just revolves around anime content, so if that's not your thing, that's cool. Just hope you enjoyed the video cast as I take a break from the anime content and talk about a live-action movie for a change, but no doubt one of my favorite ones. So follow me on YouTube if you so want, and if you're really, really interested, you can also follow me on Twitter at AlexJShort. And of course, Romney did mention this at the start of the show, I am on Geek News Reviews and Opinions.
And he also is on an additional Let's Play channel, Drac and Shadow, with the host of Geek News Reviews and Opinions, Adam Mickelson, in case people are wanting to see, if they don't want to see anime content but want to see video game content, that is also a place they can go.
That's right.
And on that note, well, if people want to get a hold of me and follow where this show is hosted, you can always visit here at youtube.com/Studio Ghost Utah. That is my main channel. You can also follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Romney's Reviews. And I'm also on Twitter at Romney Reviews. And that is it for this episode of Rhapsody in Cinema. Thank you once again, Alex, for joining us. And listeners, feel free to join me next time where my guest will be a different person.